All right, welcome back. Now we have our last faculty panel for the day. It is world-making design methodologies for climate futures. It's going to highlight the ethics of climate work as it relates to design methodologies, and we have an outstanding panel for you. So at this time, I would love to invite my colleague Phoebe Chrisman up to get us started.
Thank you, Malo, and thanks for everyone for sticking around and being here on day 2 of the symposium. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So my role is just to briefly introduce the topic of our panel and then and kick us off. I just want to take a minute to actually read the description that we wrote for the panel to really kind of just focus on the context of our goals here. So the title, World Making, Design Methodologies for Climate Futures. Reimagining our world for a changing climate requires ethical collaboration between disciplines, working together across diverse scales, geographies, epistemologies, and cultures. This panel explores how embracing the agency of natural processes, objects, and materials can produce not knowledge about, but with other human and non-human beings. Projects from Charlottesville to the Arctic, from South Africa and South Dakota to the Chesapeake, employ a rich range of methods to co-produce knowledge, and we're just going to share some of those methods with you today, and I think this is going to make a nice follow-up to the previous panel. So we'll be talking about things like scientific research, mapping, electronic sensing, music and other creative practices, and local and indigenous knowledge. So actually a very wide and rich range. The reason that we wanted to really focus this session on methods is because we were asking ourselves, what makes the work we do in the School of Architecture unique? What are the specific knowledges, skills, methods that we can bring to the table when we think about climate transformation? And so you'll hear about some of those today. My name is Phoebe Chrisman. I'm a professor of architecture in the School of Architecture and also direct UVA's Pan University Global Studies program. As the organizer of this panel, I'm joined by a special guest from across grounds, Hollingsworth Professor of Ethics Willis Jenkins, who will be moderating our panel as we proceed, as well as 4 colleagues from across several disciplines in the school. And we felt that it was really important that we have that kind of range of disciplinary discussion around methods. Each of us will briefly introduce ourselves and share aspects of our research in a really short amount of time, like 5 to 7 minutes, so that we can both raise some crucial issues for group discussion, but also reserve most of our time for discussion among the panel and also with all of you. So we're going to begin with Andrew Monsheim and Mona El-Kafif.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to be here. We are quickly introducing ourselves. My name is Mona El-Kafif. I'm an associate professor at the School of Architecture. I'm wearing multiple hats. I'm in the Department of Architecture, which is also my professional background. I'm also in the Department of Urban Environmental Planning, and I'm the graduate program director of our urban design programs.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Monsheim. I'm an associate professor in urban and environmental planning, and I'm also associate dean of research here in the school. So what we're about to do is attempt to speak to timed slides. So we already know how well this will go. Yes, I also need to advance. And here we go. So Mona and I have been working together over several years across urban design and urban planning on the problem of data analysis and action in urban public space. And really we focus on this issue of actionable information and creating social and ecological meaning that could be legibly embedded within public space. Now, the problem is that these data are often deployed towards important issues that this symposium focuses on, climate change and environmental resilience, towards informing policy, directing investment, and changing human behavior. But the problem is that the dominant paradigm, the smart cities paradigm, In that paradigm, data are deployed towards often some kind of optimization without accountability or responsiveness to the needs and concerns of communities. And so, we're left with this paradox, which is that data, fundamentally, are something that can bring light to our challenges, and yet at the same time, the act of extracting that data from environments leads to alienation and leads to opposition. So what we really want to think about and have worked together on is really community-centered sensing. First through a project that we do call it community-centered urban sensing, and then our current project, Network Public Space, we've developed an approach, let me stop this, actually, an approach where public space design mediates between environmental sensing, technologies, and community-driven placemaking.
Okay, I think it's already running. So how are we constructing a middle ground for the smart city? What are the infrastructural, physical, contextual, social, and immaterial layers of making this world? After receiving the CIF grant 2022 for Network Public Space, we applied this research methodology and these questions to 2 test beds. One is in Belmont, Charlottesville, Virginia, where we had a strong community support through Smart Seaville. And then the second one in Richmond, Chocobottom, under I-95, a site with a long history of environmental and social injustice, where until today the pollutants of the highway are damaging the communities that are exposed to this. Over the 3 years of our design research, we developed a methodology that we call Network Public Space, in which consists out of multiple layers to construct networks of the middle ground. A network of public spaces that could benefit from environmental sensing. A network of concerned citizens, as well as city administrators and stakeholders. A network of sensors, mainly LoRa and through connected Wi-Fi hosts, to allow for data flow. And then a whole system of distributed infrastructural architectures, codes, technologies that visualize data through performance. And lastly, a publicly accessible web-based platform that is allowing to monitor collected data over time to foster knowledge development. We contextualized and framed this approach as digital creative placemaking, and in our Network Public Space version, we investigate the shifting role of digital technologies as tools to employ for individual groups to create or support placemaking initiatives, how digital placemaking in combination with creative placemaking can help communities to own and celebrate the narratives of chosen sites and to provide scientific evidence for issues of their concerns, and lastly, to explore open source technologies and instructables that can be in support of collaboration processes. If we step back for a second out of our specific projects, we believe that there are 3 essential aspects that we seek and that are critical for the panel of world making. That we should design to understand design as a process of co-production, to use it to build agencies for our communities and other collaboration partners, and to share this knowledge as tools, codes, and open data. For 2 years, we now had been honored to work together with Anna Edwards and representatives of the City Planning Department in Richmond and Chocobottom, where we installed our Network Public Space project 2 times during the annual Gabriel gatherings. Anna is the chair of the Defenders of Sacred Grounds historical reclamation project in Chocobottom and worked over the last 20 years together with Joseph Rogers, defender and historian, Vanessa Boland, founder of the Richmond Indigenous Society, and Queen Nzinga, Virginia Defenders and Rastafarian elder, to reclaim the sites around I-95 so that they can serve the history. We want to stop or end this presentation with a quote from Anna, who just last October, when we installed our project on site, really framed it in a very beautiful way. Network Public Space, and I'm now Anna, you might have not noticed yet, but there is a beautiful illuminated line of columns crossing the burial grounds. These are sensors designed to pick up the particles and pollutants in the air around us, in particular the pollution that comes from I-95 and the train tracks. The idea of this project is that it democratizes the access to this information and data. So if you're living in a neighborhood that is experiencing this kind of pollution, but you have no way to prove it. This is open access technology that you can create to track this information in your communities and to use it to make your case when you need to prove that something is not right in your air or the water where you live. We want to end our presentation with this quote and are looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Lina Cho. I'm an assistant professor. Hello, back there, waving at me. I'm an assistant professor in landscape architecture in the first half of Arctic Design Group.
Yep. And I'm Matthew Joel, associate professor of architecture, co-director, Arctic Design Group. And yes, in the Department of Architecture. And you're in, yes?
Landscape architecture. Landscape architecture, yes. And we're going to jump from Richmond to the Arctic. And let me just advance the slide to the next one. Okay, so Matthew and I just returned from the Arctic about 4 weeks ago with a group of 10 students from the Arctic School of Architecture who are in our research studio this semester. And timing was really intentional, going there in the middle of the winter when the conditions are really the worst or the best, depending on how you look at it. And this is the city that we went. You see the the city and the frozen ocean with the tundra in the backdrop. And it's really kind of creating this kind of really interesting experience for our students who've been there for the first time. All of that city and then the rest of the Arctic are in fact built on top of frozen ground. This is what you see here on the slide called permafrost. That is in fact either thawing or caving in due to the warming temperatures. Permafrost has been frozen for thousands of years, acting as a living and dynamic archive for past climates. The remnants of ancient grasses, bones, ice, such as what you see, basically the traces of long-term environmental change on Earth are preserved here, and are also part of this incredibly complex three-dimensional structures where the cities are built, but also are critical material and cultural foundations for communities. Arctic is a vast and heterogeneous place with an extreme climate and climate change. Arctic today sits really at the center of climate discourse, and it's really a bellwether for change to come elsewhere. Just for the orientation, that's the North Pole. Utqiagvik that we went to was right here in Alaska. But also these changes are also palpable and immediate for the people who live here, such as the eroding shoreline, the image that you see here, due to the reduced sea ice that's no longer kind of locking in and holding that coastal edge. But what's also really palpable is the climate experience. The extremity of the Arctic climate exposes many different stories, ideas, and possibilities of climate, not just the stories of extremely bad weather. And these question the usual tools, our worldviews, as well as allowing us to test new design methods and collaborations.
So the project that brought our students to the Arctic about 4 weeks ago is a collaboration across grounds and also with two federal agencies, the National Renewable Energy Lab and the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as partners on the North Slope. It's an exciting 5-year project. And one of our key aspects of the project is to work with organizations up on the North Slope to deploy a set of sensors and do geophysical measurements on the permafrost to understand how the built environment is influencing the environment. But key to that is working with local partners to establish a set of strategies for deploying sensors and maintaining them. This all grew out of a symposium that we held about 3 or 4 years ago at UVA that brought together our youth ambassadors from across Alaska, as well as different disciplinary experts, to talk about how we can engage in the future of the North. So one of the aspects of this project that's key is in measuring with data of environmental data, terrestrial, and also geophysical data of the conditions in and around Utqiagvik. And so we've been deploying these sensors within the city itself and also outside of the city. But one of the things that we understood through the process of deploying these sensors is that in this extreme environment, the maintenance and installation and process of choosing sites with our partners has led us to see beyond the sites themselves and understand differently the context in which we're working. This is an image showing one of the study sites. It's a low-income housing project in Utqiagvik. And then a time series of data in the center, which is explaining basically how the temperature and ground temperature is changing or different around those buildings and how the building influences its environment. Combining this with geophysical measurements, on the left you'll see electrical resistivity tomography that visualizes below-grade ice content. We're looking at how to visualize the ground, but also to the right you'll see the socio-ecological analysis that our students have done to explore how those two worlds kind of come together. Combining this with numerical modeling to inform intuition and understanding fluid flow and airflow is kind of key to understanding this complex environment. One of the things that's really essential in this project is co-production, not only with partner organizations and leadership within Reykjavik, but also with young kids, with youth in the city, as well as bringing our students up to the Arctic and bringing them together to understand how we can learn. The goal here ultimately is to produce a set of design tools that the community can use for planning for future practices and also for maintenance, which is really an essential part of this extreme context. This project is really part of an ongoing process. Lena and I have been going up to the Arctic for about 10 years. Howie Epstein, one of our collaborators, for even longer. We consider this an investment in understanding how we can join conversations that are currently ongoing and to contribute constructively to those conversations. We see this project as one step in a very long kind of a series of engagements where we are looking at how design agency can bring together different disciplines and synthesize that information into a constructive framework for the future of the community. Thank you.
Okay. So today what I want to talk about is work that I've been doing, ongoing work with two indigenous communities in a very different part of the world, and in both cases working to help them reclaim their culture, sovereignty, and sustainability through design. The indigenous peoples are particularly affected in this time of climate change, widening economic inequality, racial injustice, and really unprecedented environmental degradation. And certainly, I think, as we'll be discussing today, new design methods and pedagogies are necessary to understand, imagine, and enact a more hopeful and sustainable shared future. In both of these projects, indigenous knowledge and practices provide powerful ways of advancing ecological and social justice and activism. In the case of this work, my research explores how the design of art spaces specifically can promote community thriving, creative economies, sustainable resource use, ecological restoration, and the reclamation of indigenous cultures. So what I hope to do in just a few minutes is maybe to specifically look at what we might learn from this type of collaborative design with these two indigenous communities, Xhosa community in South Africa and Dakota community in South Dakota, essentially half a world apart. So in collaboration with the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, a band of the Native American Dakota tribe, we're designing a cultural center and associated prairie and bison restoration project on their Lake Traverse Reservation. There are many collaborators in this work, and I don't have time to thank and talk about each one, but I wanted to show you the principal investigators of the work. This work often involves students. Over many years. The images that you'll see were all created by our research team. Our methods include history, culture, and field research, learning about tribal practices, and literally working together often on physical projects, including this Earth Lodge construction. These are some of my students from a studio a few years back on this construction site, along with co-design workshops on their land in South Dakota. And in this case, students from UVA and the Tribal College in South Dakota explored ideas and physical options together, and you can see us working together in some of the types of models and drawings we were creating. Today, over 60% of the tribe lives in poverty, and 40% are unemployed. Things like poor education, substance abuse, and youth suicide limit individual and collective thriving. Tribal trauma includes settler colonialization, mandatory assimilation, which involved the inability to speak their native language or practice their spiritual practices, as well as racial discrimination. And of course, many of these things continue today. Yet, the Dakota have survived, and they're committed to integrating their cultural knowledge and practices into their new architecture, and that's where we came in. So to understand their contemporary identity, we use co-authorship practices and storytelling as tools of empowerment that inform the design process. For instance, we learned about the relationship of Dakota cosmologies and specific formal geometries, which weren't always things students wanted to think about or know. It's a longer story, but there was a lot of learning to be done as we began our design work. So for instance, we learned about the importance of the TOTP as a central gathering space in their culture, and we transformed that TOTP typology for contemporary uses while using local materials and tribal building methods. So the idea is that this is self-built architecture, earthen architecture, actually, biomaterials. The co-design process prompted the indigenous community to reflect on their culture and place in new ways, while certainly UVA students were pushed to explore alternatives to their normative design methods. And I just wanted to share a couple quotes from students to think about the kind of impact that this sort of methodology had on their work. Here's one undergraduate student writing, "The idea of providing support and amplification, rather than using our already politically and financially empowered voices, formed the basis of a class that listened to the needs of the SWO, the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, and continually sought their voice, stories, experiences, and opinions to create the best co-design possible." And to me, that was a kind of amazing reflection from an undergraduate architecture student. I'm not going to read all of this, and I'm not really going to talk about the design, but I think you can see some of the cosmological notions that were part of the physical design process. But this reflection by an MArch student was really poignant for me. She wrote, "We are often told as architects that we will need to be forceful in order to defend our ideas against engineers, contractors, developers, and clients, whose input will be more likely to derail a project than improve upon it," et cetera. You can imagine. But she ends up talking about the power of bringing people together, understanding the cultures of others, and thinking about this as a kind of inspiring and new way of working. Then I want to just briefly talk about the most current project that I'm engaged with, which is working with a South African Kosak community, an arts collective, along with faculty and students from UVA, faculty in this case from ethnomusicology, architecture, and public health, funded by a 3 Calves grant, thank you, A School, to co-design the Black Power Station. And we are exploring how arts practices, again, can inform the design of indigenous cultural spaces, promoting creative economies and individual and community thriving. In this case, it's a very different type of environment. We are working in an area occupying part of an abandoned power station, hence the Black Power Station name, in Makanda, also known as Grahamstown, South Africa. It's a public art space that uses music, art, theater, poetry, and other forms of creativity to help indigenous youth overcome the history of apartheid and its contemporary legacies of radical economic and social inequality, high unemployment, poverty, violence, and very deep political alienation. The goal is to, and that's some of the artwork that students are producing already on site. The goal is really to regenerate the degraded landscape and its many buildings by putting artists at the center of collective social, political, economic, and cultural transformations that in every case integrate indigenous cultural knowledge and practices. Much like the Dakota project, we studied Xhosa history and culture. We conducted field research and co-design workshops in South Africa. We talked and we drew together. The methods are highly iterative and emergent. They treat all participants as socially and culturally situated and really trouble conventional ideas of expertise and division of labors. For instance, who's allowed to pick up the pencil in a meeting? I'll show a few images of the first intervention that is just under development right now. In this case, we're working with a steel industrial storage shed and inexpensively redesigning that shed for human habitation in this increasingly hot and dry climate. And you're probably all familiar with the environmental challenges going on in South Africa right now. So we did very simple things like using rooftop solar to provide energy and provide energy autonomy to the community. The image you see here is a large and flexible book-lined art space to accommodate performances, classes, health education, all kinds of informal gatherings. We added very simple, it's a very simple architecture, a very inexpensive architecture. We added new shade structures and large roof monitors to bring in daylight to this dark shed, to thermally transform the dark and hot steel spaces for human inhabitation. The community, as we discovered, spend a lot of their time outdoors. That's where they're socializing, that's where their eating often occurs. And so for us, flexible indoor and outdoor spaces were really crucial to supporting their way of life. We're always thinking about flexibility. This relates to the previous discussion about programmatic uses in space, to use the least amount of space to have the greatest amount of impact. So everything was designed to be shared and flexible in different ways, shared meeting spaces, studios, a new mezzanine for spaces for NGOs and artists. The design does all those things that one would expect, integrating green water, energy, and waste systems. We used local materials and regenerative agriculture on the site. What's really exciting to me is that this partnership is already co-producing both music and art in Maconda and Charlottesville. There's an event in 2 weeks a week and a half at Visible Records that I'd love to share with the community if you're able to come out. Our partner X will be there from South Africa. So we're looking at how we can stimulate arts education and community development simultaneously in both locations. So I just want to conclude with a couple takeaways, maybe, that I feel like I've learned or kind of guiding strategies from these two projects. The first, attend to differences in ontological and epistemological views. Co-design places where communities see their knowledge and culture represented. Keep artists at the center of collective transformations. And this is really important because we found that artists are often really open-minded and willing to make those changes that we discussed previously. Think about sustainability in all we do in terms of systems and materials. In this case, the idea of building with local, renewable, or found materials and self-built materials was really important. Empowering the community to build themselves, at least not everything, but things that could be made by them and with which they could have authorship. And then finally, this idea of co-producing music and art in sister spaces, that it's not us going to them and bringing everything, that it's a reciprocal kind of relationship. So maybe finally, beyond imagining buildings, we explored how design methods might advance the undoing of colonial legacies, support cultural repair, and advance economic and political sovereignty for these communities. And so I guess the final sort of argument I would make is that ultimately these kinds of participatory methods, maybe more than anything, produced a shared understanding and a kind of empathy for ways of being in the world across really diverse cultures and geographies. Thanks.
So I'm Willis Jenkins. I'm a scholar of ethics. It's really cool to be here. It's an honor and delight to be able to interact with and to be invited into this conversation. I don't have a lot of slides. I'm an ethicist. But I do find myself just responding to the obvious threads of justice and repair that run through all these projects that we've heard. And I want to say something about that perspective, and then I'll use that to open some conversation among us and then with everyone. So I'm involved in this experiment called Coastal Conservatory that connects music and humanities and the sciences in ways that we hope advances understanding of rapid coastal change. It's called a conservatory because we emphasize listening. We try to integrate collaborative listening into UVA's longstanding coastal sciences program on Virginia's Eastern Shore. So, for example, a researcher from music translated into sound a decade of tide gauge data so that you can listen to sea level rise or storminess. Another sonified measurement of a seagrass restoration so that one can listen to the return of an ecosystem, and you can find those and many other really cool things to listen to on the website. That work has informed new kinds of scientific research. So, for example, discovering and monitoring the acoustic signatures of oyster reef health. And from my perspective, ethics, I'm most interested in how this collaborative opens what I would describe as unexpected avenues of moral imagination. listening to tide fluctuations over a 5-minute composition invites aesthetic responses that may not map onto our usual divisions of climate politics. When we offer a public performance that's informed by science and history and philosophy that's expressed through sonifications and live musical improvisation in a way that allows people to immersively experience all of that, it invites participants to reweave separated threads of political and scientific and cultural dimensions in the way that they think about and respond to coastal futures, coastal change. In my view, opportunities for imagination like that are an important dimension of justice. As you know, there are grave injustices related to climate vulnerability along coasts around the world. You know, it can be overwhelming for communities who have been in place for a long time and are now renegotiating a really uncertain sense of what their future can look like. What the conservatory tries to do is offer practices that invite world-making imagination. So now we're participating in a community-led work that is meant to direct science and policy research for the Eastern Shore. That's a part of a climate resilience project that is facilitated by UVA's Equity Center. So, for example, in a January community workshop, there was an opportunity for participants from around the Eastern Shore to say what kind of scientific research they want to see for what kinds of objectives. What we did from the humanities is set up a little listening station with short pieces of sound art and then prompts for participants to say what they're thinking or feeling and what they hope for the future. That little exercise, you know, it's obviously insufficient to the scope of challenges faced by Eastern Shore communities, but it does represent one element of justice: inclusive participation in the processes by which people remake their worlds. World making happens through infrastructure and technology and policy, yes, and also through interpretation and stories and spiritualities. World making happens in, you know, all the ways that people draw on their cultural inheritances to make sense of themselves and their relations amidst rapidly changing conditions. How they remake their sense of a world, of belonging to a world. That collective work of drawing from inheritances to negotiate futures, I understand that as a form of moral repair. Climate crisis names linked forms of damage to ecological systems, yes, and also to political capacities, yes, and to infrastructure, and to the cultural forms by which people understand themselves to belong to a world. Connecting justice and repair, like I just did there, I'm influenced there by the account of reparations from Olufemi Taiwo, the philosopher who argues that reparations for colonialism and slavery, which are certainly due, should be designed as forward-looking world-making. In the context of climate crisis, he writes, repairing damages of racial injustice must be done in a way that makes everyone more capable of living justly with one another through climate stresses that meanwhile accelerate every inherited pattern of injustice. As you know, those most marginalized from global flows of wealth and power face loss of valued futures due to climate consequences of those same global flows of wealth and power. In those cases, meeting the challenge of climate change goes beyond adaptation planning, even beyond compensation for damage. Resilience includes also repair of the relations through which people make a future. While especially evident among the most vulnerable, like Taiwo, I see that as part of the task for everyone facing climate changes. So from my point of view, as I listen to these really well-informed, really thoughtfully designed projects, I'm especially interested in the ways that these designs not only offer solutions to specific climate problems or responses to particular kinds of stresses, but also stimulate moral imagination, or drive cultural reflection, or support reparative world building in ways that help folks remake their world. So with that little dose of philosophy, I am gonna I'm going to bring us back to design by opening us up to a conversation. And I'm going to invite all my colleagues to come forward, and we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask them some questions to have a conversation with one another, and then with you, if I can, there we go. Yeah, you come forward.
Okay, so you see the first question about the agency of design and its broadly defined role in the context of climate change and world making, which is really an opportunity to reflect on what is design and its role in climate. And when I sat down, I saw this great quotation from Lena Cho in our pamphlet, which said, if we were to understand climate not only as a physical phenomenon, but as a set of ideas, what new relationships between people and climate can we build? And so, Lena, I wanted to invite you to kick us off by saying what kind of ideas of design and its role were behind that question.
Yeah. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you, Willis, for that first kickoff question to me. I think we talk a lot about design agency, and for me, coming from humanities in my undergrad and my previous life as a designer in landscape architecture, and having been here for a number of years, in order to address, for example, the issues of climate change, we first and foremost really question and understand what climate means to us. And for me, that is part of what we're asking as designers. It's not just about, as you mentioned in your talk, it's not just about rebuilding, making things more resilient in a kind of traditional sense, but as you mentioned, in how we can begin to imagine through many different stories that we encounter, histories that we encounter, also the kind of narrative imaginations and stories as a part of the speculation, and how can we begin to reclaim those stories through collaborations, through kind of untraditional ways of working together. And for me, that is essential part of what kind of defines design agencies, especially in the age of climate change, when all of things are really changing and kind of taking inside and outside. So I'll leave it at that for now and let other colleagues to chime in.
Okay, well, I think one of the kind of aspects of agency for designers is that we can imagine a different world. And, I loved your thoughts about world making, about helping or allowing people to think about their future and how we make our world and we can remake our world in another way. And in the previous panel, there was a discussion about resistance sometimes to change, right? And I do feel like the thing we bring is the willingness to question and to really understand that all of this was designed at some point. Social systems, economic systems, physical environments, and that we can actually change them. And I find that even with a lot of my students, when they're starting out, there's this notion, oh, well, we couldn't do that because that's not how it works. And so maybe there's a suspension of disbelief sometimes that anything is possible. And when I say anything, I don't mean anything, right? But that it should be fully embedded within communities where we're working. But just that ability to think outside the box, which is something that's quite simple but really sometimes unusual, I find, in collaborations.
Yeah, maybe I jump in, and Andrew, you can just add. I think we mentioned this on one of the slides that we defined design in this context as a design of the process, how people and everyone who's participating in a project, how they are working together. But I think we also had a real emphasis specifically on the earlier projects like CCUS to build tools. We are tool beings, right? We have pens and forks, and this makes us in a lot of contexts human, though there are a lot of animals who also have tools. But I think we really emphasized what can we build as tools that is easily accessible, that allows people to access data, to feed data into the interface. So CCUS, for example, was designed to
allow citizens in the communities that we worked with, which was north of downtown and Fiveville, to take pictures and to upload it into the database. And these were all related to illumination during the night and broken street lights, and it's too dark, it's too light, very subjective perspectives of how people are perceiving their streets. And there was a way, like a digital pinboard, where people could engage and contribute to the discussion. It has downsides in the sense of we all have full-time jobs. And those people, and including ourselves, but also specifically residents. So you can put a lot of tools out there into the world. There's still time that people have to contribute. And the biggest learning takeaway from the first iterations of our projects was, now we know, and what's happening? Like, you need actually cities who are picking up on these issues, because otherwise the only thing that you're producing is frustration.
Mona or Andrew, could I ask, you used in your presentation the metaphor middle ground and middle space, and could you say something about the role of design in cultivating those middle grounds or middle spaces?
Sure, absolutely. And I think it also situates, the first thoughts that come to me, being the resident planner on this panel of designers. And I think, Phoebe, here we go.
Planners are designers.
No, and
They are.
well, this is the wonderful thing. No, I'm getting there.
We're all designers.
First of all, my undergraduate degree is in architecture. But on top of that, I think that yes, I agree. I fully agree. And it's a wonderful thing to be welcomed in by designers. But I think at the same time, the question of the middle ground gets me to kind of the first thought that I always have, which is that if planning is part of design, I do think that putting it in a folksy way, planning makes the world safe for design to some degree. Or that's the best thing we can be doing, is setting the parameters and the guidelines to make production, co-production, to make creativity and all of the complex kind of, the creativity inherent to design, whether it's through expertise or through long-term community knowledge, manifest to make that possible. And so what do we mean by the middle ground? We're dealing with a very, with this technical problem, this problem of smart cities, but I think it can apply in a non-technical, non-smart cities context as well, which is just this problem that we create systems. We create political, governmental, regulatory systems that determine what happens in public space, what happens on the ground. And yet, at the same time, those systems don't always hear the stories that people tell, the lived lives and the long-term cultures and histories that are embedded in a place. And so if designers have a role, and this time I am talking about designers and planners together, it, to some degree, has to be about finding that middle ground, because regulation will continue. We heard about this from our alumni panel in really clear terms and really compellingly. That will all continue. And what can we do to make that bridge, to be the ones who listen, who have skills that can actually mediate between these two dimensions that, that fundamentally persist in our political economic system? So that's one way that we think about it, but.
Yeah, no, just to follow on that, I think there have been moments in our work in Alaska where I have really questioned what is our agency, what are we trying to do here? Do we really have a place? Because, in a sense, some areas of the world that are facing the most extreme cases or effects of climate change, they have problems that need to be solved tomorrow or today, and they're very practical problems. And these are things related to health and life and well-being. And at the same time, during those moments of uncertainty, I also understand that the conversations that we're having, and I know all of the projects that we're talked about today, the people we're bringing together as designers, the conversations that are happening, are really catalyzed through the inherent methodologies that we employ as designers. This synthesizing multiple viewpoints spatially, intellectually, numerically, data to, and those kinds of moments of irregularity that emerge from the sort of repositioning well, as you mentioned this in your really beautiful kind of setup for the conversations, a way of reflecting on and maybe renegotiating paths towards the future. You know, and very much in the Alaskan context and elsewhere, for sure, there's this conversation about the sort of climate change as being a moment of kind of post-colonialism, right? It's like we need to, climate change is allowing oppressed communities that have to chart their own future. And that's in a strangely beautiful thing, but at the same time, it's still fraught with so many challenges towards what does that future look like?
That is a great transition to the second question we have. So this one, I mean, coming from those themes of justice and repair, how do considerations of justice and repair inform design methodology, which is really just inviting you to elevate what was almost explicit in each of your presentations, and then vice versa, how do these projects illuminate how to understand justice and repair? So that is to say, I'm especially interested in this, and I find myself, reflecting down this way. Well, how do these designs sort of inform or reorient or fill out the ways that we talk about justice or the ways that we understand what repair might mean? Phoebe, let me invite you to go first.
Okay, sure. Well, I think one example that I would bring is from the project on the reservation in South Dakota, where when we spent quite a bit of time out there, and one of the first things they did was show us the government housing that was built for their community. So this tribe was moved from Minnesota to the Great Plains. They were imprisoned in Fort Snelling. This was not their original homeland. When they came to this area after about 50 or 100 years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs built these concrete block rectangular barracks, essentially, to house them in, which they now continue to live in. And so so they showed us that housing, they talked about their cosmologies, about their creation stories, about the importance of essentially axis mundi. I mean, that's not the word they use, but the connection of ground to sky, the importance of centrality, the importance of circles in their culture and how that was important. And of course, the students, maybe I shouldn't say this, but my students didn't want to draw circles. They're like, oh, we're not allowed to draw circles. That's not cool. It has to be like blobs. It has to be complex organic shapes. It has to be rectangles. And the community said, no, we're serious. Like, we want this to be a circle. That is crucial. That is absolutely crucial. And so for us, working with them, with their formal geometries, with the importance of certain cosmologies and manifesting those in physical form was a sort of cultural repair that we weren't. They're like, no, you're not going to put us in a box. Like, we don't want that anymore. And so maybe that's just one kind of repair, but the notion that the structures in which you live and gather need to reflect your knowledge and your values.
Yeah, I was struck by your observation that community members offered knowledges that the designers or design students didn't necessarily want to know or think that they wanted to know. And I just wonder if others of you have encountered something like that, where there's either input or feedback or ideas that at first don't seem like they fit in your idea of the design process or the overall collaboration. Yeah.
I think that's a great question. It also gets back to your question about repair. And I think, the easiest way for me to talk about this is, again, to describe a little bit more about Mona and my, our work, which, again, is collaborative work. I want to say, across not just people at UVA, but fundamentally the partners in the community that we have worked with. It's their project. It is their leadership. It is us becoming an adjunct to that project. And so I want to be really kind of careful with that. But it also gets to this question that you're asking. I mean, our kind of emphasis on that is part of what we've, inherently, needed to define our role as because of the nature of the work. So this project is at a site that is, fundamentally been at the center of human histories that have global implications, but very local as well, for thousands of years. But particularly starting with colonization, It's a site of markets for enslaved people. It's a site of an enslaved person's jail. It's the site of where in the 1960s, and fast forwarding a little bit, I-95 was built over a burial ground for African-American people living in the neighborhood of Shockoe Bottom. It's a site where the rail yard is built, and now it's a site with significant environmental challenges that is going to become, in the future, a designed site for a historical campus. And so we walk into this, and fundamentally, this is a long history. It is a history with individuals engaged in this for over a long period of time. And so to some degree, how do designers come into this? How do we come into this kind of long history and make sure that what we're doing is the right thing? And again, Matthew, you already raised this issue. For us, to a great degree, it's of course about listening. It's about being open to kind of changing course, like going 90 degrees, turning 90 degrees, maybe not 180, but learning that what we thought was an environmental justice issue, fundamentally about climate change, about the problem of the highway, is a social liberation question. One of the people we worked with fundamentally said, environment matters, but it matters to me in the context of a long-term story of liberation. And hearing that and thinking about how what we're doing is multiple things, I think, is something that's really important to us.
Yeah, and maybe to add to this, there was this one drawing with multiple layers of, was originally the hunting ground of indigenous people, and then at some point Richmond was founded and City Grid was laid out, and then there's a whole history of enslaved labor. It became the parking lot of VCU, and all of this layered on top of a graveyard. And when we started working and conducted this research, at some point, I remember when we were presenting it on a conference, I thought, the place had been made over thousands of years, and we are flying in with our concept of placemaking, adding a digital layer. And conceptually and theoretically, there's tons of research and literature that can make a ground for it, but it really felt like this is a microsecond of what the place actually is. And I think it was also therefore so touching that Anna then at the end of the last event said what she said, that it is a microsecond, but the fact that we have these data now creates an incredible agency for us. And thank God, I have to say, I don't want to be religious here, but Richmond at the moment is extremely open for these discussions, and they are very willed to improve their environment. I-95 is actually going to be covered further north in order to address these issues. So it's a wonderful moment actually in the context of the city and what the city is trying to do for its communities.
I think just a couple anecdotes I wanted to share just recently that left quite an impression on me when we were in Alaska. One was a kind of explanation describing the context of the Arctic where this transformation that it's undergoing now, a kind of a trauma that's being inflicted on people who have understood the ground as the frozen domain. This is a place, there's a sort of understanding of the environment as a place that is going irreversibly. This word repair is interesting because I know you're using it a certain way, but at the same time, there is an irreversible transformation that's underway. A second point that was made was this notion that there are some places people have lived for maybe 100 years that were important for mining or extraction, and there are other places people have lived for thousands of years, and that's because of food, right? And identifying those places, one of them is the town that we're working on the North Slope. That's one of those places that's for thousands of years. That is where people have lived because of food. And that depth of that connection and the importance of that going back so far was very powerful. And the fact that when we're there, people would thank us for being there. Like, just thank you for coming here and being interested in the challenges that we're facing. Because we're outsiders, we always will be outsiders. And the question then is how, it's important for us to listen, to also understand traditional knowledge and elders as best as we can, but also to how do we contribute without bringing ideas and repeating what has happened in the past. And that is one of the really delicate moments, I think, now that we face as designers as engaging in this future, but doing it in a way that is concurrent with charting and the people that are being able to chart their own destiny, but at the same time helping to catalyze that with them.
If I can add a few more things there. I mean, especially in the case of the Arctic, the history of the Arctic landscape is, in a way, really inseparable from the history of science and military engineering, especially. And ironically, we're working with both of them on this particular project. So on the one hand, we're trying our best, at our kind of, UVA kind of research team level, but also with our collaborators, to, in a way, I don't know, maybe this is like, to undo or contribute to the undoing of that injustice that has happened, in the particular North Slope, but also throughout the state in the Arctic. But also knowing, that history, I'm also constantly asking myself when we're doing this collaborative work, what new kind of injustice we may be bringing without really realizing that we're bringing, And part of that too is that, earlier there was a session about slow change, the landscape of slow change. And in a way, the pace at which we're asked to do research and also design, I don't think I don't think it works entirely well with the pace that we need and the time that we need to develop the relationship with the community members. As Matthew mentioned, we've been going back to the same city. I think the first time we went there was, 2008? 2008. And we've been going there more regularly in the past 10 years, and we still feel like we are still learning a lot, about the community members, the things that are changing, the needs and desires of the community. But I think that's also, in a way, part of the dilemma and the tension that's bringing to these questions, especially in, kind of the fields that we're operating, that I think it's more, more of a systematic level kind of concern and a change that I want to also highlight as well.
So we're about to think about research challenges, but we have a few more minutes left, and I want to pick up this theme of repair and irreversibility that you just raised, Matthew, and invite other people to reflect on it. It's one that I think about quite a bit from the context of work on the eastern shore of Virginia in this longer-term community imagining process where people we are involved in a process that will hopefully provide tools and knowledge that will help people think about what kind of futures they want there and what kind of futures are possible. And there was just a kind of intense exchange among community members in our last advisory council meeting about how to think about just this question. And so I wanted to ask you in design work specifically, wrestling with the kind of stress that rapid environmental change, or let us say irreversible aspects of climate change. I mean, how you think about solutions or resilience or whatever the the midterm objective goal is in this broader context.
I'm jumping in. I'm actually jumping in with another project. Is this okay?
Great.
Perfect. It was a question that I had in the last panel, or something that I wanted to address. So I am at the moment working together with the Trust of Public Land, and we are engaging with the community schoolyard project. And just for everyone who doesn't know what this is, the TPL is converting public black tarred schoolyards, specifically in neighborhoods that have a problem or challenge with public space access and park access. So they are trying to address multiple challenges simultaneously. So it's a park equity problem, but it's also the problem that kids who are in overheated schoolyards obviously will not have great grades, because that is just an environment that is not kid-friendly. So what they are doing, and I find this very impressive, and I'm trying to expose my students to this, and some of them are sitting here, which is really nice. They are building multiple agencies together. So it's about building stewardship. So understanding that there are multiple interests that are actually can come together in a project. And they really developed a participatory design model in which the kids are able to design their schoolyards. And that is not happening by just taking a pen and designing it, but by developing over many 20 to 30 years now, they developed a kit of parts, approach and also a game-like approach where kids are simultaneously learning how to do this. But the most powerful outcome of this is if a kid understood that they can contribute in a positive way to climate change. They are not going to be overwhelmed in the future. They understand and learn right from the beginning that they have an agency, that they can help to make this a better world. And that is extremely empowering. And at the end of the day, if you really want to address climate change, every single person on this planet needs to be able to help in this process, in whatever role. And I think design in this context can really help to empower everyone who is a part of these communities, and I find it extremely touching. I mean, you can integrate really what green infrastructure is into the education of kids, so they'll learn this even in multiple classes. So it's a really great model.
You know, I think I'll just say to that problem of irreversibility versus repair, or what are those two things, you know, to some degree, I lean on the communicative power of design, you know, to some degree. And what I mean by that is that ultimately, those are decisions for people living in communities, people who have histories, people who have come in recently. They may not have histories, they may be migrants. But fundamentally, you know, we have a preference for democratic processes or community-based processes in our society, or we say we do. And if that's true, then I think that design, if it can do something, it is to be able to make these issues manifest in the environment, in the world around us. And I think that often, you know, the problem we're all confronting is that some things are hidden, and they shouldn't be hidden. And other things have been valorized when really they're a very singular way of looking at the world. And so if we can shift that through design, then maybe we can empower the communities that need to make those choices more effectively. And I mean, that's a hopeful statement, but that's my hope for what we do.
Yeah, let's transition on hope out of that question. That's great. I want to come back to Lena's observation about some of the challenges to collaborative design. Yes. Okay. Good. So now this is for everybody. What are the interdisciplinary potentials and challenges in producing and deploying knowledge, and does community engaged and co-productive work differ? It's really helpful to make that distinction within the particular projects that you were mentioning. So let me there's several kinds of questions that are on the floor here, but this is really just an opportunity for you to pick up that reflection on what what needs to be supported better for design to do what it needs to do in the context that you're working. You know, we can look at you first since you began the question.
Well, I think one of the things that I'm definitely realizing, especially through the project that Matt and I described, is how, even if we want to be collaborative, how siloed we are within our own discipline. And that is not to say that we should just get rid of all disciplines. No, I don't think so. We should definitely have that kind of uniqueness, you know, in our own kind of ways of approaching and addressing the world, but also thinking about how can we work together across different spectrums, not only disciplines, but sectors, through across worldviews, values. And that's really hard. I mean, we talk about that a lot, but it's a really, really hard thing to do. One of the things that we didn't mention during our talk was that we are also research subjects in this particular research. So there's, of course, environmental scientists, engineers, STS, social scientists, and us. But the social scientists and then the anthropologists, they're actually looking at the way that we're working together or not working together, and giving us feedback and comments about how we can do better. And that's been a really interesting process because I've never been a research subject before, not that I know of. And it's really fascinating to see what we do through the lens of other disciplines, especially when, many, many years ago, Matthew and I used to go up to DC, to these 1-hour breakfast meetings, sitting at the table with policymakers, people from Pentagon, all sorts of things, trying to explain what we do. And it takes a long, still it's really hard to explain what we do to other people who are not in design disciplines. So it's been really helpful, at least for me, to hear through other perspectives or through other disciplines that we do. And they're really studying our design studio, our collaboration, the way that we communicate across different cultures and values. And one of the things that also we're learning is that there are certain words that we use constantly throughout the disciplines that nobody really agrees on. For example, the landscape, data, environment, climate. I mean, everything that we do, right? Design, exactly. Culture. I mean, the list really goes down. And it's really not to say that we should all have same perspectives on things, because that would just really flatten out the richness of the world. But it's really about how we understand other perspectives, other people's definitions, other disciplines' way of seeing the world, and then work with those in a way that also makes sense for us. And I think that's where, for example, the potentials, interdisciplinary potentials, and challenges really lie at. And I don't know, we still have a lot to figure out and really have a conversation on, but that's one of the really illuminating parts of our own work. I mean, not that I'm a research subject, but the things that come out of that.
But I think it just changes the frame too, the being studied. I mean, one of the things is going to a community and working with members of the community and stakeholders. We're arriving in someone else's place, and in a way, we're studying them. So now we're being studied by our colleague. And so it actually helps to recalibrate essentially what that sort of type of interaction means, and reframes essentially how we're working. It's very helpful. It's kind of unnerving at times, but I love it. It's been illuminating for us as a project. Yeah.
I find I think Lila, you said it's about terminology. I mean, just between Andrew and me, sitting more or less in the same school at least. I mean, the hesitance, our hesitance to use the term design, because sometimes planners think we're not designers, and I recognize how careful I am with this usage of this word. But on the other hand side, we have to see everyone uses the term design. I mean, specifically engineers like to use the word. So we should not be shy of what we are doing, specifically at the A School. What I recall, specifically working together with our colleagues from data science, at some point, we were using similar words, but not really the right, so there was a lot of confusion. And at some point, we exchanged our reading list. And I thought, that's a really good way, so that we actually understand what are we referring to theoretically. And it was beautiful to see that we had one common reading, which was Bruno Latour's actor theory network. And it was really good to understand this. So who are we on top of it? I think designers, once more, can contribute tremendously. I also remember when they were then, at the end of the day, developing the sensor system, and it was all about open source and accessibility, etc. And at the end of the day, telling the visual story, how to actually put this together, how to code it, how to download it, all of this was really visual storytelling, and that is something that designers can really do very well. So crafting the instructables in a way that it can be understood by others, specifically non-designers, is really something that is very important if you want to close the loop.
I think one thing that's really interesting to me about this discussion is, and relates to my experience as well, that it's actually easier for me to work in a community in South Africa or South Dakota sometimes than with my colleagues in engineering or environmental science. I don't mean that in any negative way. I'm working on a big NSF grant right now, and it's really hard. I'm looking at Tessa, who's also working with us, and it's hard, right? And because we talk so much about interdisciplinarity, working transdisciplinary, but when it comes down to it, we just see the world often really differently. We use different methods. We often have different values. Sometimes we want the same thing, coastal resilience in the case of the project that I'm working on. But the way that we're getting there is very different. Somehow, when I work with communities, the two projects that I showed, I don't know, I think we go into it just being completely open, and they're very open, and we're not coming in like armed with our disciplines in the way that maybe happens through those other grants. So I don't know. I don't really quite know why that is, but I feel like it's very different. Like, because we talked about community engaged versus kind of interdisciplinary.
I want to pick up on a line from from your presentation, Phoebe, to continue this thought, you emphasize the importance of epistemological and ontological difference between communities and the researchers who are going there. And I guess I wanted to ask, well, what happens when there's ontological or epistemological, or let us just say deep differences within the communities within your working? How does that affect the role of design and the process?
You mean not with us, but with them? Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly the case in South Africa where we're working. So we have been negotiating between the National Arts Group, who has a big music festival in Makanda, who uses that land at the Black Power Station for events, and then our community group, the indigenous group, who basically is squatting there. And so there's a real power dynamic. The folks running the arts festival are all white. They're all speaking a different language. They're not seeing eye to eye, and I found that we've ended up being kind of, I don't know, maybe mediators in some way, that somehow I feel like we can often bring them together, even though that's not necessarily our job to do that, but we can bring them together into the same room and talk about how we might move forward, how they might continue to occupy that space and allow it to be used, you know, that it could be used in different ways by different people over time. But we're not gonna change everything. I mean, there are limits, right, to what we can do. I mean, when I talked about the kind of legacy of apartheid and some of those issues, I mean, for instance, with the Black Power Station, that power station only generated power for white South Africans. The Black township did not have electricity. And so for them, squatting and taking over that abandoned power station is an act of reclaiming, of repair culturally, because they never had access to that place in a kind of way. So yeah, we end up kind of in the middle sometimes. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you know, I think it would change in every project. Whereas in the case in South Dakota, it's really the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the sovereignty of the reservation versus the town that surrounds the reservation, where they actually have different criminal laws, you know, and you can be tried differently by a tribal court than a local court. So these are really deep, deep, deep differences in both cases related to, you know, colonization.
I realize that as you're talking that, I mean, there are such important methodology issues around community engagement, around community co-production, around community-led research, and we could spend, and we all have spent months and years thinking about them. And then, but in the remaining like 8 minutes we have here in this section of the program, I'm kind of thinking about the deep differences we have within our own communities around climate transformations. And I think I would like to ask you, how do you think about the role of design in our own state, in our own United States, about the role of design in negotiating or mediating or ameliorating pretty deep epistemological conflicts around climate stress?
Yes, I wanted to come back to a comment you made earlier, but answering this question as well. I think this idea of irreversible, too, within this idea of climate change and how we approach this notion as designers. I think that ultimately, one of the things that maybe is influenced from a kind of Western perspective, this idea of permanence, that we believe that there should be answers, and the answers should solve problems. Is maybe an issue that needs to be addressed. I know a lot of us are already doing that, but I think maybe just to put that on the table for the moment. And I think that probably you could look past in the history of the communities we're working with, or particularly indigenous communities, that how there has been this idea of cycles of change and the idea of dynamism in terms of moving and mobility, and how it's a sort of Western notion of being fixed. Is maybe something that has been introduced. And, I think this actually underscores, in a way, one of the strengths UVA is as a school of architecture, is this idea of bringing together multiple disciplines. But I think more important than that is a sort of systems-based approach of not thinking about purely the edifice or the fixed answer, but actually about the methodologies and process and systems which underline or underlie design strategies, so that any approach towards climate change needs to be thought of in terms of not necessarily fortifications, but in terms of a system strategic planning approach. So, Andrew, you talk about planning, and is that design? It is a beautiful form of design, and it's probably one of the most important forms of design. And we see that in our work, but we also, acknowledge that maybe, this idea that a building or structure is an answer, to quote climate change or something is maybe going down the wrong path. But
Sure. I mean, and let me start with the last point first. And I think, I don't want to get in trouble with my colleagues, I think. But to some degree, no, around this planning and design question. I think ultimately, yeah, we exist together. And I think to a great degree, planning is a product that is, bounded by, legal frameworks. It's different in the US than it is in Europe. It's different in Alaska than it is in Virginia. Fundamentally, though, yes, it is a discipline that is a design discipline, certainly more than potentially other disciplines that claim design. So thank you for welcoming us in. But I think to the point that you're talking about, and to your question, Willis, I think, I do come at this as a transportation planner. And so when you ask this question, I think about the 15-minute city. And this idea that, oh my God, I've been talking about and learning about since I was a master's student in the 90s. And it's, that there's a transit-oriented development or a walking radius around, within which all of our needs might be met. And suddenly, there's a huge revolution against this, that the 15-minute city is fascism, that it's trying to lock people down and prevent them from being able to, travel outside of their designated zone. And so I think that's a problem, right? That's a real challenge that we face. And, clearly that we've gotten ourselves into this mess means we don't know exactly how to fix the mess. But at the same time, I do think that what Matthew is talking about is part of the solution, which is that, if we talk about the 15-minute city and say, oh yeah, it's a solution for climate change that's, going to get you out of your car, immediately people's heads explode. But if we talk about it as a way of living, a way of being, a choice, a way of reinforcing values that people hold around a quality of life, there suddenly are openings. And I think to do that, there does need to be a sense of design and a sense of, engaging communities in more than one way, not just through regulatory frameworks. And so, I don't have anything more to say about it because it's a huge problem. But I think your question about epistemological difference is well taken. And the climate change, I think about it from transportation point of view. This is what we run up against when we try to propose what we think are really meek little solutions of maybe this part of the city could be a part where you walk instead of drive.
I think you're asking a very, very challenging question. I'm thinking, sitting here and trying to find words how to answer it, because just the word climate change is something that some people don't want to spell out or don't want to believe in. So how are you even starting a dialogue here? Maybe a little bit from the method that are coming through urban design. So very often these projects are not just a top-down master plan, but they are developed through scenarios. And these scenarios offer multiple opportunities for development. And what is really important is that you, for example, then in a context of a community engagement process, that you are allowing the participants to really understand consequences. And I believe that most people do care. They do care about their kids. They do care about that they can grow up in a healthy environment. They also care about non-human lives. So in the moment when we can communicate this through our visualizations, and there are a lot of great techniques that we are developing these days, we can capture attention. And then at the end of the day, it is discussion. It's also political discussion. And this needs to be debated. But I think designers can create a stage. the process as well as the stage.